just wait for it to start. And get rid of the transcription. Okay, there is a transcription that you can turn on for yourself using the 3 dots at the top of the screen if you need subtitles. All right, so welcome to the second event in Birkbeck Students' Union's In Conversation with series with the lovely Dr. Joanna Bourke and Dr. Anne-Marie Foster. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Naomi Smith, one of the student leaders at Birkbeck Students' Union and a postgraduate research student in the School of Arts here at Birkbeck. I'm just going to say a little bit about the series, why we wanted to do this, why we think having these conversations is important, and then I'll hand over to Dr. Foster for introductions and to kick us off. So the idea for this series of events, where basically we're pairing established Birkbeck lecturers with PhD students and early career researchers, both from Birkbeck and the wider academy, as it were, for a conversation about their research and their personal path into academia. It really came from 2 places. Firstly, we wanted to give students an opportunity to hear about all the amazing research that's happening at Birkbeck in a less formal setting than the classroom. And conversations which are often a lot more dynamic and more free-flowing than a lecture seemed like the perfect opportunity to do just that. And secondly, we really wanted to involve students and early career researchers in those conversations to sort of bring together both halves of the university, as it were, in community, something which we always need more of at Birkbeck, and particularly at the moment where we're not always on campus so often. So after that very quick introduction, I am going to stop talking now and just say thank you so much to Dr. Bourke and to Dr. Foster for agreeing to take part in this. And I will now hand over to Dr. Foster for introductions and the rest of the event.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very, very excited to be talking to Professor Bourke today. Before we begin our chat at all, I just want to offer a very quick warning for those of you who aren't familiar with Professor Bourke's work about the sorts of topics that she's written about. So Professor Bourke's work has covered death, fear, military violence and sexual violence. So if this isn't quite the right event for you right now, or if you want to strategically plan some tea breaks for when certain topics come up, do feel free to. So my name is Dr. Anne-Marie Foster. I'm a historian of modern Britain, of ephemera, death in the First World War, and I'm currently a research fellow on the AHRC funded project Ephemera and Writing About War in Britain 1914 to the Present. I very sneakily asked Naomi to put the website link up. I have for yours as well, Joanna, so please don't worry. So I am delighted to be talking today to Professor Bourke. So Professor Bourke is an enormously inspirational both historian and public intellectual, is how I'm kind of categorising you in this event. Her work has spanned social history, cultural history, and the history of emotions, and on topics as varied as female labour, masculinity, fear, rape, and most recently about human, animal, sexual and love-based, I suppose, platonic interactions. So Professor Bourke is currently the principal investigator of the Wellcome Trust-funded SHAME project, which stands for Sexual Harms and Medical Encounters, which we will chat about in due course, and you can see the link as well in the little chat box to the side of your screen. And Professor Bourke is also currently Professor of Rhetoric at Gresham College, as well as Professor of History at Birkbeck, obviously. And you're currently in the middle of a lecture series, your 4th for them, I think, on sex and modern history, which has been very entertaining so far. So you can go and listen to all of the past lectures that she's given there. So the idea of this was that we were going to have quite a general chat, as Naomi's already said. I was originally going to leave about 10 minutes for questions, but as there are only a few of us here, I think if you want to pop them into the chat box, we can probably incorporate them as we go. And we can make it quite a fluid conversation between the, I want to say 8 of us. I'm not sure that maths is right, but it's been recorded for posterity now. So do put questions into the chat as we go, and we'll try and weave them in. So I wanted to start with a very nice icebreaker, given the kind of purpose, I suppose, of these chats. And my icebreaker is a 2-parter. So the first part of the question is, what drew you to history as a profession? And the second part is, I suppose, what drew you to the subject that drew you in? Because you started your professional life as, of course, a historian of Ireland, and you've moved away from that in recent years. So what drew you to both the profession and, I suppose, your first historical love?
Yeah, look, thanks so much, and thanks to Anne-Marie and to Naomi, and of course all the others, the Student Union, and those people who've turned up. This is really, really looking forward to this. Let me just say, Anne-Marie, it's always rather daunting for me when people introduce me, sort of as they have to give a health warning.
I do. No, I'm sorry, I do it for my own work, don't worry.
Well, you also said I was entertaining, so I think they probably balance each other out. But look, I mean, I love history. In fact, I was always an English major. But at the very, very last moment, I should say, I'm a New Zealander, I went to the University of Auckland, and I studied history and English. But at the very last year, I decided to switch 100% over to history, mainly because I had a most inspiring lecturer who was one of the first, I think she was the first in New Zealand universities to teach women's history. And I just fell in love with the topic, and I sort of ditched English, even though, as I may come back to later, I'm very much into literature still, and focused on history. And I guess for my MA dissertation, I decided to write a dissertation on contraception in New Zealand in the Catholic Church, attitudes towards. And here I just, luck plays a huge amount of, hugely influential here, because one day I just went to the so-called archive of this Catholic church, which the archive was kind of in the loft. It was uncatalogued, it was just some boxes. And, like most historians, I loved we're all pretty voyeuristic, so I love just going through people's stuff. And I came across this small box, which was letters written by women, Catholic women, to the priest saying, what can I do? I don't want this child. I got pregnant inadvertently. The church says I can't have contraception. And I just went through this box and was totally enthralled. And that's how I got into it. And of course, it was a really easy move for me to go from looking at the Catholic women in Britain, in New Zealand, to looking at it in the case of Ireland. And I was really lucky to be supervised by a really great, truly great Irish historian, Oliver MacDonagh. I was his last student. So that's how I got into the topic. And, once you actually read the materials of people from the past, it is really addictive, because they are people so like us, but so unlike us. And that's what I love about history. So that's why I did it.
I'm already about to go off the questions that I asked you. So just based on that. So when you were in Ireland, did you then use the Irish Catholic archives? And how did you find your experience of them? Because I've heard very mixed things from colleagues who've used them in the past couple of years, and especially in the last year, it's obviously been very difficult because of mother and baby reports. But what was your experience researching in Ireland?
Well, firstly, it was incredibly inspirational for me, because this was, the first time I'd been to Europe. I'd been to lots of places in Asia. I've been to the States lots of times. I actually grew up in Haiti, and I grew up in Africa and Solomon Islands. So I hadn't been to Europe. So it was incredibly exciting for me. And if there's any PhDs here, you may have this experience as well. I applied to do a PhD on a totally different topic to the one I ended up doing. That's fairly common. I was meant to be doing a PhD on Irish nuns. There's a hugely rich literature on that now, but when I was younger, there wasn't anything. And I started that project, and I just lost interest. So the big thing, for any PhD or any early career, or anything, any writer, is you have to do something you're passionate about. So actually, I switched at that stage after about 8 or 9 months to looking at women workers in Ireland. And, you know, this huge shift that happened in Ireland from women being workers, employed workers, or working on the family farm to being full-time housewives. And so my question was, why? Why did they move from being quite independent, working women on the farm, family farm, to being full-time housewives? So that was the question I was asking. And I have to say, as a little footnote to that, even though I didn't ever write that book on Irish nuns, one of my best PhD students, Carmen Mangan, who actually is now a colleague of ours at Birkbeck, she did a PhD with me many years ago on Irish nuns. So she kind of did it for me, and she did it a lot better.
Oh, that's wonderful. So that's kind of bringing us on quite nicely to our next, I suppose, topic about, I suppose, how your research ideas have changed and evolved over time. So obviously for this conversation, I have dipped back into some of your past works, and reading them atemporally, it seems like the kind of the preceding, your kind of research is seeded in the kind of preceding book almost. You can see this linear progression, which we shouldn't identify as historians at all. But certainly your writing kind of suggests that you've had a fairly linear path through your kind of thoughts, and they've kind of emerged very nicely through your books. So is that the case? And I suppose, how have your research interests developed over time? And are there any projects that perhaps you wanted to do and didn't, instead of started and didn't like?
Okay, interesting question. I mean, from my point of view, it's difficult to see a trend, but I know that it's there. And, you know, when I've thought about it in the past, I can actually see, okay, I started with Irish women, working women. So obviously, not obviously, the next book seemed naturally to work on working class men and women in Britain. So I kind of moved over to British working class history, but also that was when I started to get really interested in masculinity. So that was the big leap there. So it was still working people, but it was men and masculinity as well as femininity. And, you know, when I was writing that book, it's called Working Class Cultures, one of the few times that working class people actually write letters and diaries. So we actually hear their words as opposed to being mediated through a middle-class commentator, is during wartime. So I started to go to the glorious archive at the Imperial War Museum, reading all these letters. I wasn't particularly interested in war. I was interested in their love lives, you know, their relationships to family members, friendships, sport, all that, you know, what they were saying in their letters and diaries. But of course, I got drawn in. So naturally, that led to a series of books on war. Dismembering the Male, which is on the First World War, and Intimate History of Killing being the most, the two I liked them, enjoyed writing the most. And I guess those two books, Dismembering the Male, I mean, Intimate History of Killing, in my head, they're kind of two sides of the same coin. So Dismembering the Male is about trauma. It's about physical dismemberment and psychological trauma. But, you know, in the course of writing that book, I started to think, hang on here, Joanna, these men are suffering, but they're also inflicting suffering. You know, that war is about killing people. And so I became really interested in this. The book after that was Intimate History of Killing, by thinking, well, how do just ordinary men, I mean, not socialized warriors, just, you know, someone who works in the local shop, how do they end up on the battlefield killing someone? And that was the real big question for that. And I was really struck when I got into military history, which was and still is, although not to anything like the same degree, a very male-dominated field, that, you know, military historians had a tendency when they were reading some of the same diaries that I was reading, that when they came across a passage, where you literally see the hands start shaking, I went, had battle today, I can't cope, and I'm all, and you can read it, you can see that they are traumatized. They would say, trauma, shell shock, PTSD. When they read the same diary, the same person, saying, just went into battle. Wow, it was great. I'm a man. I'm so excited. It was exhilarating. They said, they don't really mean it. They're just writing for folks back home. So my big thing there was, I guess, well, we need to really take this seriously. Maybe they were traumatized sometimes and other times not. Why? What distinguishes them? That was my war stuff. Logically from there, as you probably worked out before I did, got me into the history of emotions. So again, it's a natural progression, I guess. So I wanted to move out of strictly military stuff. So emotions, history of emotions, and then what it means to be human. And there was a nice thing happening there, and a history of pain. So it does kind of make sense, and a history of rapists. So actually it's 10 years ago now, I can't believe it. I wrote a history of perpetrators of sexual violence, a topic that I've just recently returned to, much more in the context of victims. So that is kind of the trajectory of the work.
No, but it's been wonderful to look at this progression as well, and to see how it kind of emerges as again, someone very junior to the field. So as you've just so well put it, you are kind of one of the foremost historians of emotions currently working. So I think that kind of what your work draws out really beautifully is that kind of emotions are contingent on kind of time, space, and experience, as well as social and cultural factors. So for people who are listening who are perhaps unfamiliar or who are maybe wanting to start work on the history of the emotions, how do you as a historian start untangling all of this? How do you kind of work out how people are feeling, how they're culturally expected to feel, and how this has changed over time? Because it's a big, difficult topic, really.
Yeah, there's some fantastic work being done in this field now. I mean, really, really sophisticated. In fact, I think it's one of the most sophisticated areas of research, that and the history of the body and the history of medicine. These are three extremely strong areas of research. And I think, and people do it differently. As you say, one of my real interests is to see how the emotions change over time, that emotions that may have existed in a society at one time in history are not there the other time, or they've changed subtly. And so even something, just to give an example, even something as basic as fear of death has changed quite dramatically in British and American cultures over time. From 19th century, the fear of death was very much the fear of a sudden death. So whereas today, of course, we want to just go quickly, at least I do. But the sudden death, when you don't have time to make your peace with God before you enter into his world, his realm up there. Things like the fear of death being the fear of premature burial, which is very strong in certain periods in the 19th century, fear of being buried alive, now actually changes very much for a lot of people to fear of being wrongly required to stay alive, obliged to stay alive through resuscitation techniques and all that. So you lack, you lose a sort of an honourable or a good death. So even something as basic as that. And I think anyone, no matter what kind of approach you take to the history of emotions, it does require a real close reading of language. Because words mean something, and the changes in words used to describe a internal feeling state can tell you a huge amount about that society and people living within those societies.
Absolutely, and that's clearly your literary training coming through as well, which is why interdisciplinarity is so important, but we will come to that in a bit. But It's really proving that point really beautifully very early on in this chat. So I suppose because of a lot of what you do is very emotionally freighted. So, you know, you talk a lot about violence, you talk about taboo subjects, although you're very good at showing that with a lot of taboo subjects, people are actually allowed to talk about them. It's just who and when and how. But taboo subjects. So how do you find, I suppose, working on this very kind of difficult emotional subject matter? And I suppose what motivates you to keep researching it as well?
I think, I mean, you put it actually much better than I could have, that, you know, so-called taboo subjects such as bestiality, which I published a book on recently, or sexual violence, or killing, you know, the pleasures that some men, ordinary men, taking. These are taboo subjects, but they're also subjects that people talk a lot about. That the more taboo, the more so-called taboo something is, you often find that actually behind the scenes there's actually a huge discourse about that. I think I'm not so much interested in taboo subjects as taboo subjects. I'm particularly interested in subjects which are really emotionally powerful and have a huge impact on people. And they turn out to be, to a large degree, taboo subjects. And I think that I'm drawn to it because they are subjects that reveal something about what it means to be human, about our society and its values, about the things that make us uneasy and awkward. I mean, when I'm writing about sexual violence, for example, you know, it reveals something which is incredibly interesting. And that is, we all know that we want to be loved and we want to love. So why do so many people, largely men, but why do they commit acts of such cruelty? So this is a really interesting question. I think for any historian, but not only historian, any discipline, I think, that it's curiosity that drives us to do our work. And if it wasn't that incredible curiosity about other people, then we wouldn't actually do anything. That was my phone. Anyway, that's my answer.
Brilliant. So I suppose, given that your work is so broad and has been so broad, and changeable, who would you say has influenced you the most, or which thinkers have particularly influenced you, either present or past? I'll leave this very open to interpretation.
Well, I'm not going to talk about the present because I'm going to miss out some people and that'll get me in trouble. But if I'm really honest, I read a lot of poetry, and I think, you know, poetry is great for academics because, I mean, non-poets, academics, because of the attention to language, the attention to meaning. So I'm really, I guess, the biggest influence on my entire career is the poet Adrienne Rich. I mean, she just, her Dream of a Common Language, if you haven't read it, it's a beautiful, beautiful, tiny volume, very accessible. But, you know, her work, her attention to language, her attention to the emotions, her attention to issues of equality and justice is so important. And I guess, so she would be the biggest. And then, of course, there's people like Bell Hooks, who who actually just recently died on the 15th of December, who's also a huge influence on me, all her work. I mean, one of her early books, Ain't I a Woman, which is a reflection on Black women in feminism, which, you know, provided one of the, well, for me, first ways of interrogating my positionality, interrogating whiteness, interrogating issues of power and responsibility of all of us to engage with the world and to create better worlds. And she does it, Bell Hooks does it in a way that also really centers on not only issues of collaboration between people who may disagree, but we collaborate to create better worlds, issues of collaboration, but also issues of the body, the role that sensuality plays in politics. Something that when I first read her stuff on that, just kind of blew me away. I just thought, yes, I understand, that it is the body, it's the sensual, it's the way we make connections with other people that generates ideas, that makes what we are doing, whatever it is, worthwhile and valuable. So I guess that those are the really big influences, and neither of them are historians. Now, I do have influences who are historians, but they're my friends, and I don't want to miss anyone else.
More than fair. So I suppose being influenced by them, I'll start again. So I very much see a lot of your more recent work as a form of historical activism. I don't know whether you agree or not, so I'm going to carefully couch it.
I definitely agree.
Good. Okay. Then we can continue. So I suppose kind of presumably you've been in part influenced by them, but also perhaps I suppose the subject that you study in and of itself. But I suppose in the last kind of 10 or so years, you've quite clearly spoken out against the militarization of society, and the Shame Project. I think you're going to do a lot really in terms of kind of speaking about sexual violence globally. So I suppose, how do you see your role as a historian in particular, or maybe as an interdisciplinary scholar, as in kind of shaping public discourse? Where do you see yourself within, I suppose, the broader social context?
Yeah, I mean, I very much see myself now as a historian, as a public intellectual, as an activist. It wasn't always the case. It grew quite slowly, if I'm honest. And I think it started to develop after the publication of An Intimate History of Killing, because for the first time, people outside the academy were reading me and writing to me and telling me off and agreeing with me and demanding a response. I mean that in a really good way. So, I mean, I literally have boxes of emails and letters from servicemen, many of them serving servicemen and some ex-servicemen and women, I have to say, responding to me. And, I couldn't just ignore them. I mean, I could, but, that would be kind of rude, and New Zealanders are taught not to be rude. So that was really when I started to engage with people outside the academy, and discovered that I just learned so much. That actually it was a two-way process. I mean, I was obviously telling them about my scholarship, making my arguments and showing what evidence I had and defending or not my arguments. But at the same time, they were teaching me things. And I became, I guess, this may sound a bit strange, I became less frightened less timid in those kind of engagements, that I just learned that it was a two-way process, and that was a good thing. There's also, as you've already said, Anne-Marie, that as a lot of my topics demand that I intervene in public debates, most obviously sexual violence. My first book on sexual violence was driven by fury, absolute fury, because I started to realize just how things had got so much worse for women, so much worse. I mean, so let me just give you one example. 1970s, of cases of sexual violence that are reported to the police and go to court. 1 in 3 end in a conviction, 1970s. 1 in 3. 1980s, 1 in 5. 1990s, 1 in 10. Today, it is less than 1 in 20. More than 1. Yeah, less than 1 in 20. So we've had 4 decades of feminism, second wave feminism, 4 decades of legal reform, actually good legal reform, 4 decades of education about sexual violence, at every level, and things have got so much worse. So that book was sort of driven by, this is not right. And that's really what drives my activism. Militarization is another aspect which has really driven me. I mean, I wrote a book called what's it called? It's called different titles in America and in Britain. In America, it's called Deep Violence, and here it is called
Wounding the World, I think.
Which I really learned a lot from writing that book as well, because it is about how deeply embedded the military is in not only in our technologies, in our everyday life, in the wars that we fight abroad, and we don't see us as being part of it, in our imaginary, what we dream, what we see in the cinema and everything, how embedded this is in our society. So that also really, really, really drove me.
Absolutely. So just quickly on the militarization, because I think you published a book in 2014, well, we'll come back to sexual violence, so, but because you published a book in 2014, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how the kind of events of the First World War centenary, Brexit and Trump, which all are often, I suppose, mashed up together, have, I suppose, maybe entrenched those ideas even further, or is that perhaps a too negative reading of what you see? I was wondering what your thoughts on that were.
The centenary, I think, was really a major turning point. I was asked to do a review essay for a journal based on the books that came out then. And it's incredible the number of books that came out for that. And so I was sent literally dozens of them, many dozens of them. And I started to read them. And there were some good ones. But what really, really struck me was the main theme. As I say, there were some excellent ones, but the broad overall main theme of these books was our father, uncle, mother, daughter suffered so much. Look how much we suffered. Was it worth it? And there was almost nothing. And they used words like sacrifice, and they used all of what in English lit we call high diction, warrior and sacrifice, and you don't ride a horse, you ride a steed, and all that sort of stuff. But there was almost nothing or so little about the violence that we inflicted. So it just really sent me back thinking about the Intimate History of Killing book. That nothing had changed. Things, it was so lopsided. Our uncles, our fathers didn't do that to other uncles and fathers elsewhere. And I think actually in terms of militarization, as you rightly say, Anne-Marie, has got worse because of Trump, because of Brexit, because of the highly polarized debates that we are all embedded in now today, which has really given a free card to a kind of militaristic way of doing politics.
Also, I suppose, a lot of kind of modern day commentators say that this rise in militarization is obviously linked in the kind of rise of violence towards women as well, and minority communities especially. So I suppose, what are you doing with the Shame Project at the minute? And could you tell us a bit more about this? Because the two issues do really go hand in hand, don't they?
Yeah, they do. And Anne-Marie, I mean, what you just said right then is really, really spot on, because there is good evidence about what kind of society has very, very low rates of sexual violence. And one of the, I mean, all the studies show, literally all the studies show, one of the main things, characteristics of societies with low levels of violence against women is low levels of militarization. It's one of the big ones. The other ones, by the way, are societies with low rates of sexual or gendered violence have low levels of militarization, high levels of female employment, high levels of female equality within society. So, you know, the two, as you just said, are totally, totally linked. But the SHAME project, it's a Wellcome Trust funded project. And as you say, it stands for Sexual Harms and Medical Encounters. So what makes the SHAME project, I think, different from other research projects and public engagement projects that look at sexual violence is that we focus we focus on medical aspects, psychiatric aspects, public health aspects of sexual violence, because, you know, sexual violence doesn't only affect the bodies and minds of victim survivors. Sexual violence affects their families, their friends, their communities, the society around them, all of us. You know, 1 in 5 girls and women will experience sexual violence in their lifetime. 1 in 5 of my friends will experience it. Okay, 1 in 12 men, boys and men, will also experience some sort of sexual violence in their lifetime. Then there's all their family and friends. So this is a huge issue of public health. It's a huge issue of happiness, of equality, of living fulfilled lives. You know, it's really, really important. And the SHAME project is it's a collaborative project. It's interdisciplinary. We have people working on a variety of topics. We have people working on British colonial Africa, on Paris, France, anthropology, on campus cultures, on child sexual abuse, on Indigenous women and law in the States, on sexual violence and AIDS. And my particular project, well, I'm writing the broad book, which is about, you know, medical and psychiatric aspects of sexual violence. But actually, and here's breaking news, I have just finished the copy edit for a new book, which is called Disgrace, Global Reflections on Sexual Violence. So it's a global history. And disgrace is about, it is disgraceful where we are now. You know, it is a disgrace that so many people minimize the harms of sexual abuse, especially sexual abuse against particular minoritized communities. It is, you know, it is a disgrace that the legal system is letting so many people off the hook, so many perpetrators, offenders off the hook. It's a disgrace that so many boyfriends and husbands think they have an entitlement to the bodies of their so-called loved ones. It's an absolute disgrace that the sexual violence against men and against non-binary and against trans people is ignored and minimized or even encouraged. And you know, so the book is a call for action, or call for activism. I mean, it's an academic book as well. You know, it does an academic argument, hopefully in a really open and accessible way. But you know, that's what the book does, and it's coming out with Reaction Books, later this year, around June.
Congratulations! I'm looking forward to that. So I'm quite aware of time, so I am going to say that if anybody has anything that they'd like to ask Professor Bourke, now is the time to put it in the chat. Oh, brilliant, there is a question straight away. Thank you, Kate. I'll read this out for everybody, just in case you're not looking at your screen right now. So, Kate Errington says, in September, I started my PhD in the medical humanities. I have a background in English literature, but as my studies have progressed, my focus has become much more historical, which is brilliant. How would you recommend I prepare myself for the shift in discipline? Are there certain books or thinkers that you'd recommend, or even history modules at Birkbeck that Kate might audit?
Yeah, I mean, being interdisciplinary is a positive. There's nothing negative about it. And moving from one to the other, you learn new skills and you learn new ways of looking at the world that can only strengthen whatever thinking any of us do. Literature, medical humanities, history, these are very, very compatible type subjects. And as I think I said earlier, medical humanities is so strong right now. And so is history. I mean, here at Birkbeck, we have one of the best degrees, MA degrees in the medical humanities. So I certainly would really, really recommend that, which would give you, to audit that, it would just give you a really, really firm grounding in the field. But also, I think, whatever we do as thinkers, as scholars at any level, is, I guess there are a number of things that are really important. The first is to read other people's work. You need to be able to situate yourself within a community of scholars, so you know where you fit in that. The second thing is predictably write. I mean, I write every day. It's good just to get into a habit, even if it's just one tiny paragraph. I throw away so much of what I write. I go through many dozens of drafts. The more you write, though, the more you hone your own voice, the more you find your own voice, I should say. And finding that voice is really important. And I think, those are the things that I think are really important in terms of, thinking about how you're going to make a difference in the world through scholarship. And that's not the only way to make a difference in the world, but it is one way. Happens to be the way I like, and it sounds like you do as well. So.
Oh, that was a wonderful answer. I hope that's been what you wanted, Kate, but it was actually very useful for me because I was going to ask you about writing, but we ran out of time. We do have a second question from Naomi, and I'll read it again. So going back to the subject of bell hooks and her influence on your work, I was wondering if you would describe your work as intersectional, both in terms of intersectionality as a form of critical inquiry and as a form of praxis.
Absolutely. And bell hooks was the one who alerted me to intersectionality. Her work about that, you can't understand people's positions without understanding all of the layers that go into into making them up. And that's really so important. And I think, speaking of myself, when I was an early feminist, for me, everything was about gender, race, and class. That was the Holy Trinity. It still is the Holy Trinity for me, but there's so many other layers that I think we need to add to those three. Such as, disability, such as generation, such as age, such as sexualities, which my early days I didn't interrogate in my work. And the richer we can make these connections, the better our arguments will be. And this is why, if I can just say just a brief word, which goes slightly off what you were asking, might know me, but actually I think it is relevant. And that is, we do need to be fighting for much, if we're going to do this better intersectional history, we also simultaneously need to be fighting for a better intersectional, diverse academic community. There's some terrible statistics based on the UK that shows that of all white male academics, white male academics, 15% become professors, 15%. Of black male academics, 8% become full professors. Of white female academics, 6% become professors. That's the top. Of black female academics, it's 3%. You know, if we are going to do good scholarship, we need to sort of start looking at who we're reading, who's teaching us, how we're teaching it. So yeah, and Bell Hooks, you know, she was writing ages ago, and she was writing right up into her death, just in December, 15th of December. I'm still mourning her. But you know, even her early work knew those basic truths.
And I'd even say, you know, make sure that the departments that we're trying to hire people into are anti-racist and, you know, aren't ableist and all of that, because there's been a lot, especially in history, with the, I'm thinking of the race report in particular, which shows that not only are people not being promoted through, but actually they're being promoted through incredibly hostile scenarios.
Yes.
But we will do that here. Are there any final questions on that rather powerful note?
Sorry, I've talked too much. I'm sorry. I do apologise, everyone.
You've not talked enough. We could do this for another 2 hours. Whether you'd like to or not, obviously that's a different thing. Kate says thank you very much.
Before we go, can I come in, unless you've got something, Anne-Marie, you want to say? Because I just want to say also, I think your work, Anne-Marie, is so fantastic, you know, and also innovative, you know, that you're really at the cutting edge of a kind of history that not many people do, and certainly not many people do. Well, I shouldn't say this particularly well. You are just really fantastic. So if anyone in this listening to this hasn't read some of Anne-Marie's work, please do. It really is an inspiration.
Thank you very much. Well, you're the inspiration, really. But I'm going to, I suppose, I think we should probably wrap up there. Thank you very much for your time. That's been really illuminating, and it's been a lovely chat, quite powerful in places, but I think that you kind of perfectly encapsulated what you are, what you represent, and more importantly, why Birkbeck is so lucky to have you, and why all of the students at Birkbeck and staff are so lucky to have you as a colleague, a mentor, and a teacher. So thank you very, very much.
Can I just say, I'm just so lucky to be at Birkbeck. If anyone looks at my books, they will see that I thank Birkbeck students in nearly all of them, certainly all of my books in the last 12, 15 years, because, I mean, Birkbeck students are smart. They're hardworking. They're often juggling lots of stuff. They come with, many of them come with lots of experience that is just really improves the whole teaching learning experience. So I mean, I'm so lucky to be at Birkbeck, and so thanks to the student union here as well for doing such a great job.
And thank you to Naomi for organising this.
Thank you. Yeah.
So we're going to hand back over to Naomi, so she can tell you about the next In Conversation event for the student union now.
Just make sure I'm not on mute. Thank you so much, both of you, for a fantastic and yes, very inspirational discussion. I've been loving these events so far, and this did not in any way disappoint. So and thank you to all of you for coming as well, and for giving us your lunch breaks. And yes, the next event in the series is actually a slight departure for us, with a conversation between two Birkbeck archaeology lecturers, Dr. Leslie McFadden and Dr. Catherine Hill, and that will be next Friday, which I believe is the 21st at 6 p.m. The event's not up on the union website yet, so look out for that in the next couple of days, either on the website or on our social media, and probably university emails next week as well. So we do hope to see you then, and again, thank you so very much for joining us today, and again, thank you to Joanna and to Anne-Marie for such a wonderful discussion. I'm going to turn the recording off.